Bourbon is everywhere right now, but most beginners actually start with the wrong map. They misunderstand value, they chase the wrong logo, and they think that older and stronger means better. And I did that too. So this is the guide that I wish I had start to finish. And by the end, you'll understand whiskey in a way that even the pros will respect. And for the pros, I honestly think you'll be surprised by a thing or two if you stick around. But before we even pour a glass, let's zoom out. What actually is bourbon? How does it fit into the greater whiskey family? Many of you have already heard this, but all bourbon is whiskey and not all whiskey is bourbon. So we can think of whiskey as a family and bourbon is just one of the kids. So who are some of the other kids? Well, for starters, we have Scotch. And Scotch is malted barley, aged in Scotland, and sometimes it can be smoky with peat. If it's from Speyside, it's usually fruity, and if it's from Islay, it's smoky. And then we have Irish whiskey, which is triple distilled, it's lighter, fruity, smooth. It's famous for its pot still whiskey. It has unmalted and malted barley. And then we have Canadian whiskey, which usually is stated as rye, but it's interesting to note that it doesn't necessarily have to have rye to be called rye in Canada. And lastly, we have Japanese whiskey. And Japanese whiskey is really Scotch inspired, a lot of times in Mizunara oak, which adds incense and sandalwood to the flavor profile, but you're generally gonna get a very Scotch-like flavor profile from Japanese whiskeys. And that's just part of the whiskey family tree. Here's the kicker though, even within bourbon, if you swap just one grain, you completely change the whiskey. Involve yeast, it gets even more wild. So with that, what is a mash bill? Well, simply put, a mash bill is just a recipe of grains. You have corn, rye, wheat, and barley, each imparting something particular to the final product. Corn is sweet caramel, rye is peppery spice, and then you have wheat, which is soft and mellow. And finally, you have barley. It's the nutty backbone, but it really provides the enzymes that make fermentation possible. But grains, they just set the stage. Fermentation writes the script. Yeast doesn't just create alcohol, it creates flavor profiles called esters, like apple, cherry, pear, even banana. Okay, so here was a really big aha moment for me. And if you'll bear with me, I'm gonna nerd out for, let's say, 30 seconds to 1 minute, and then we'll move on. I was recently sitting down with Kevin, the head distiller of Hirsch, and we were talking about yeast and the role it played in the final flavor profile of whiskey. And I was really shocked to learn that it was really not the yeast itself, but the environment that was provided to the yeast when it was put into the mash bill. I always thought that it was the yeast itself that produced a particular flavor profile. And although that is true, it's really more so the environment in which the yeast is put into that mash bill. So what I mean by that, or what Kevin meant by that, is that when you affect the environment, let's say a warmer temperature, less oxygen, or underpitch the yeast, you create stress. And that stress produces more esters as a byproduct of the yeast doing everything it can to do its job, right? And grow. And so distillers will do one of two things. They'll do everything they can to prevent that from happening because they don't want those unwanted flavors, or they lean into it and they manually or purposefully create that stress so that those flavor profiles are more prevalent in the final product. Think Brown-Forman and that banana. So their yeast has a proclivity to actually produce that banana flavor profile, but when they overstress it, they get more of it, and it comes through a little more predominantly in their final product than, let's say, other whiskeys. And when you talk about beer, it is almost always the case that they do everything they can to prevent those esters from coming through. You want a crisp and clear lager or ale or whatever it might be, but then you go somewhere like a Hefeweizen, and that's when they purposefully put that yeast under stress so that flavor profile comes through. I just thought it was a really fascinating part of how yeast works in the distilling process, both for beer and for whiskey. So now you know how whiskey is built, but how do you actually find the whiskey you're looking for? Let's take a little time to talk about distribution and hype. So let's just start with something simple like Buffalo Trace. It's generally a whiskey people hunt when they first get into whiskey. And it's not a problem with the whiskey itself or the distillery. It's the system that has been built around it. And here's how that system works. It's called the 3-tier system. It starts with the distillery, it goes through a distributor, and then it finally makes its way to the retailer. And along that chain, everyone is competing. The distributors are competing with each other, and then the retailers are competing with each other. And then it gets to allocation. So now along that chain, there's allocations at the distributor level, then there's allocations at the actual retailer level. And so when you see that allocation make its way down the pipeline, when it finally makes the stores, there's a limited amount of product. And with that limited amount of product, they may do things like lotteries or raffles or whatever it may be. And that may have nothing to do with the quality of the whiskey, but simply the amount of whiskey available for purchase, right? All right, so Buffalo Trace, Eagle Rare, Weller, they all sit at the center of this massive hype storm. And they're tied to things like Pappy and George T. Stagg. And the honest truth is we apply this enthusiasm for bottles like Buffalo Trace just because of their difficulty to find. And when you finally find that bottle expecting fireworks, what you find is an approachable 90 proof bourbon that is smooth. And that's what it's intended to be. And for that reason, it's not a great bourbon to try when you're trying to learn about whiskey. It's an okay bourbon to try. I'm not taking anything away from enjoying Buffalo Trace, Eagle Rare, or Weller. I enjoy them myself. But if you're trying to learn about the nuances of bourbon, it's probably not your best option. It's like getting a Ferrari and keeping it in first gear, right? You're missing so much of the world of opportunity if you just look around you at so many of the available options that offer unique expressions of what bourbon can actually be, instead of a massively blended whiskey that's meant to be smooth and approachable. All right, let's say you land a bottle, hype or not. What's the next challenge? Well, how do you taste it without just getting ethanol burn? And honestly, it's my favorite part to talk about because I think it's the biggest barrier to entry into enjoying the hobby of bourbon or whiskey in itself. Okay, so with that, let's start with how to actually smell a glass. I'm just gonna pour a little bit of this in here, that, and then we'll walk through how to actually nose and smell your whiskey. I'll start with some of the more simple concepts and we'll move through some that you may have not heard of before. So the first thing is to crack your mouth slightly. It's going to allow the ethanol to dissipate and you'll get much more of the smells and the flavors that you're looking to kind of dissect when you're not faced with a face full of ethanol when you keep your mouth closed. So simply crack your mouth, short sniffs, a little bit away from the glass, and you'll find it does wonders for your experience. It may be a little difficult at first, but I promise over time it gets really, really easy and it'll become second nature. The second thing is your nasal cavity, it's called the nasal cycle, shifts from your left to your right throughout the day. And because you don't know which one is going to be your dominant nasal cavity, I know it's a weird thing to say when we're talking about drinking whiskey, but you don't know, so just move from your right to your left nostril and see what different notes you can pick up. I think it'll do wonders when you're like, I can't smell anything, and then you give your dominant nostril at that time a little bit more opportunity to smell, and you'll pull out some notes that you didn't pull out otherwise. So you have your mouth cracked, you've moved through your nasal cycle, trying your left and your right nasal cavity, and then you move from top to bottom of the glass. And the reason for that is aromas stratify, and you'll have some of those lighter fruity esters or lighter fruity notes at the top of the glass and those heavier oak and spice notes at the bottom of the glass. So you'll simply just put your nose to the top and smell, and then put your nose to the bottom and smell. And you'll find that you pick up different notes along that kind of from top to bottom. And obviously you can do the middle as well, but just move. So you're basically moving left to right, up and down with your mouth cracked open. And then if you've been doing this for a while, you can close your mouth and get even a stronger punch of flavor to your nose. So there's tons of ways to manipulate how you smell the whiskey and bourbon to pull the most out of it. And so hopefully that's a little bit helpful when it comes to how to smell your whiskey before you actually get into the tasting portion of the experience. Okay, so this next one is actually my favorite trick of all time. And it's simple, actually. After you drink your whiskey, you simply exhale through your nose lightly. And I've spoken about this before, 80% of what you taste is actually smell. So now that you've coated your tongue, you've tasted the whiskey, and you just swallowed it, you're going to exhale, and it's going to open up all those flavor profiles. It's almost like cranking up the amplitude of what you're tasting, and you're going to pull out, or be able to pull out, I think, a lot more notes once you breathe out slowly through your nose. It's really cheat code in my opinion. So I do this every time I'm trying to pull out a particular note, or I think I'm onto something. I'll do a light exhale through my nose right after drinking, and it really helps accentuate those notes that I may be struggling to pull out. So I really advise you giving this one a try. I think you'll really enjoy it. The last thing is, don't be afraid to put a drop of water. I know you're like, this is a fantastic whiskey. It's made the way it's supposed to be. It's straight from the cask. That's awesome. But I promise you, if you drop just a drop of water, there's these alcohol clusters, and I forget the name. I think it's like micelles or something like that. But and I know I botched that word, so go ahead and tear me up in the comments. While I'm at that, why don't, for those of you that are enjoying this content, it does me a huge solid if you go ahead and give it a like. If you want more of this content, go ahead and hit the subscribe button or turn on alerts, because I got tons more coming your way. So sorry, shameless plug, but back to it. So you drop that water, you break up those ester clusters, because those esters are maybe hiding within those micelles or those clusters. And then when you put that drop of water, it really opens up a lot of whiskey. And I promise you, the master blenders, master distillers, they do this as well. They're really trying to understand the kind of the art of the possible with what they have in their hand. And they're going to leverage things like a drop of water and proofing it down to understand what the best this whiskey can provide is. And so you're not in a place where you're ruining whiskey in any way, shape, or form, which sometimes can be the sentiment out there. So to break all that down, tasting isn't acting like a snob and trying to look fancy. It's really about just slowing down, using science to understand what you actually have in your glass and getting the most out of what you have in your glass. But with that, as I said before, there's something else that you can use to kind of elevate what you're tasting, and that's glassware. So let's start with the Glencairn. And the Glencairn was created based off of the Copita style glass in the early 2000s in Scotland. And it is one of the most common glasses you'll find in the whiskey world, because it does a great job of funneling those aromas up to your nose in a concentrated manner so that you can pull apart and dissect the flavor profiles of the particular whiskey. From there, you have a couple style glasses that do different things, and then you'll see variations of those which you can kind of, enjoy. So the first one is a narrow rim glass. And what a narrow rim glass does, amongst some other things, but primarily is funnel those fruity esters into a very concentrated form up to your nose. So if you're looking to pull apart some of those fruity esters, then those narrow rim glasses will do a really good job. But then you have those tall tulip style glasses. And those glasses do a really good job of stacking aromas. We spoke about that earlier, drinking from the top of the rim to the bottom of the rim. And if you get one of those larger tulip style glasses, you're going to be able to really dissect those different layers of aromas. And then you just have a wide rimmed glass. And that's really just to lessen the ethanol burn and kind of disperse the flavor a little bit more, so it's going to be less concentrated, so you'll get less out of it. But at the same time, if you're not looking to get smacked in the face with those flavor profiles, then you'll be really looking to have a glass like that. And so there's varying degrees of this. So you have these mini Glens, you have the tulip style, and then the more narrow rim like a Glencairn, a mini Glencairn. You'll find these a lot at club events, single barrel events, when you're looking to temper the amount of alcohol that you're drinking, but still get the flavor profile of a larger Glencairn. And those are fantastic options when that is the goal. And then, like I said, you have these taller glasses, one with a narrow rim to get more fruity esters, and one with a large tulip style opening here so that you can stack your aromas better and go through, like I said, those fruity esters on the top and get to those heavier oak and spicy notes at the bottom as you move up and down the glass. This is a fun glass to drink out of. Then you have that same concept at a shorter sprout little dude. So this one is going to have a narrower nose with the wide bottom. So you're going to have a larger concentration of those fruity esters. And it does a really good job for me of pulling apart those flavors. And then you have glasses like this, like a neat glass that has the fatter bottom and a little bit wider nose than a Glencairn, but it's still tulip style, right? So you're going to be able to, like I said, stack those aromas and get a lot out of your tasting and smelling experience. So there's many others other than that. And then the last one that I should probably talk about is a standard rocks glass, which is honestly one of my favorite glasses and one I use more often than not, because it complements most of my situations better than some of these glasses, which is I'm just drinking with friends and family. And the point of that environment is not to pull apart nuanced flavors, it's to enjoy my time with friends and family. Okay, now I'm going to go through a bunch of bottles that teach a particular lesson. So first up is Sagamore. And Sagamore Rye is a fantastic option when it comes to learning about rye whiskey. They've been doing it for a long time. They do a great job of not only rye whiskey, but finished rye whiskeys and aging rye whiskeys. And so if you're looking to learn about rye, or if you think you don't like rye and want to play around with it a little bit, then Sagamore is kind of a one-stop shop when it comes to rye, and I highly recommend it. The next one up is makers, and I know I talk about makers a lot, but when it comes to wheated profile, if you're trying to learn about wheat and the part it plays on the final product, then makers has been doing it for a very long time. They do a really good job. So whether it's the maker's cask strength, the standard makers lineup, or a limited release, any of them are going to be a great option. It's really the one that you can get your hands on, and that would be perfect for learning about wheat. Next one is Michter's, and for most of these, it's not particularly about the bottle in my hand, but about the distillery in most cases. So Michter's is a great distillery to pick up a bottle from to learn about low entry proof. Michter's does a really good job of low barrel proof entry, and I think that that's a really good bottle to learn that lesson. The next one is Bardstown. This one's a little harder to find. It's the Discovery series, so it's any of them. I'm not particularly saying Discovery 11. I know Discovery 13 just came out with mixed reviews, but if you're able to get your hand on this, Bardstown Discovery series does a really good job of teaching about blending, the art of blending. It's like, for example, I remember the first bottle of Bardstown I had that had Tennessee whiskey, and I was thinking it was Dickel, and I'm not particularly a large Dickel fan. I was like, I'm never gonna like this whiskey because it has that Flintstone flavor profile, and they did a really good job of blending, because blending sometimes is more about pulling a particular, like let's say you think it's almost near a finished product, but it's missing one particular thing. A really good blender understands how a otherwise maybe not so good bourbon to some people does exactly what you want it to do in the overall blending process. And so they leverage those different flavor profiles of the particular barrels to pull their bourbon in a particular way. And Bardstown does a really good job of that, amongst many other people like Found North. I'm obsessed with Found North. I know they're very hard to find, so I know that's a little bit problematic, but they do a really good job of blending Canadian whiskey. So next is craft. By craft, I don't mean like super small, although it can be. I'm just meaning not one of the big distillery names. And I believe wholeheartedly that they are driving the innovation in our current industry. And I'm fascinated with the places that they're going to go as we kind of see the demand decrease in bourbon. And one of the ones I am so excited about is Dark Arts. If you can get your hands on Dark Arts, I think they are doing really amazing things. I think they're doing it for the right reasons. They really do enjoy the blending process and sourcing process. And the last single barrel I did with Dark Arts, I spent a lot of time there and just had a remarkable time drinking through tons of their different expressions, and can't wait to get back. So Dark Arts is one that I recommend if you're looking at sort of the craft, the smaller distilleries. Frey Ranch is another great one that's a little bit bigger, but they are pretty widely available, and they put together some really good products. And so like, let's say, I was talking earlier about chasing Buffalo Trace, when you have something like Frey Ranch that's going to offer a much wider range of flavor profiles and easily available, then it's kind of the better option. For me, when teaching someone about whiskey, or even if you've been drinking whiskey for a long time, this is a better option in my opinion. And then you can get even a little smaller, like something like Driftless Glen is doing some really fun stuff. And this one is Bourbon de Naranja, and it's basically like an old fashioned without the sugar. And so that was a really fun expression for me to try. So you got Driftless Glen, you got so many places that you can try whiskey. I think I need to do a whole lesson on just craft and smaller distilleries. Okay, now big picture. And big picture for me has always been about community. Bourbon has always been communal, whether it was taverns selling by the barrel, shared glass by glass, or prohibition, where people continue to make whiskey to share with friends and family to keep whiskey alive. And even now, during COVID, when there was groups and meets and shares that went virtual, whiskey was at the centerpiece of bringing these people together during a difficult time. And we can look deep into history and see that whiskey is the centerpiece of a lot of amazing and fantastic stories. So that's what I want to bring into focus, is that yes, whiskey is great, but what is most important to me, and I think what is the most important to the story of whiskey, is its communal nature. Its ability to bring people together from different cultures, backgrounds, and unique experiences, and sharing stories and making memories over a glass of bourbon or whiskey. Okay, and now if you remember only one thing, remember that the best pour isn't the rare pour, it's the one you enjoyed. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you, and I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.